Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Happy Thursday. Welcome to Resilient Church Leadership's The Backstage webinar. If you are joining us for the first time, can I just say a warm welcome to you? If you are wondering what in the world have I stumbled on here on Facebook Live or here on Zoom, let me just put your mind at ease. This is not another leadership development webinar podcast for the life of the church during COVID. Lord knows that we've had so much content and stuff like that thrown at us as pastors and ministry leaders. No, this is a project of resilientchurchleadership.com. And here at the Backstage, we take an hour each and every week to kind of pause and reorient our hearts and our minds back to the backstage of our lives, the things that matter, character and soul care. So we hope that this time is a blessing to you as we host a conversation today with three good friends on how to actually love our enemies. So welcome to the Backstage. My name is Eddie Copeland. I'm coming to you live from South Florida, where I not only serve as the host for our dialogue here at the Backstage, but I lead a movement of churches called Church United. And I'm joined today by Dr. Jim Wilder, who has been training leaders and counselors for over 30 years on 5 continents. He's the author of 18 books with a strong focus on maturing and nurturing relationships for leaders. He has co-authored the Living Form and the Heart Jesus Gave to You. Dr. Wilder has extensive clinical counseling experience and has served as a guest lecturer at the Fuller Seminary, Biola, Talbot, Point Loma, and many, many other seminaries across the globe. We're also joined by our good friends Mindy Calguire, the founder of soulcare.com, and Dr. Margaret Diddams, both who are usuals here and regulars at the Backstage. Dr. Diddams is an organizational psychologist and principal consultant at the Diddams Group. So with that, let me just say welcome, everybody. It's good to see you.
Well, hey, good to see you too.
All right, Mindy, maybe we could start with you because you've actually known and followed Jim's work for quite a while. Can you maybe just set the stage and give some context, and let's just jump right into our dialogue?
Yeah, happy to. Guys, I'm so excited that you can join us today and listen in on this conversation. We'll also be open to receiving questions in the chat on Zoom or in the Facebook messaging. Please make sure to questions in there, and we'd love this to be interactive along the way. But just to give you some context, I live here in Colorado, just outside of Boulder, and I have been following Dr. Wilder's work for some time. I think we met maybe 10 or more years ago at a conference where we were both engaged with leaders around the themes of spiritual formation and leadership. And where I came from a more sort of operational side of how soul care and spiritual formation was working or not in various leadership contexts, Dr. Wilder, yes, speaks into many of the operational contexts, but was really coming from a neurological perspective and many years of integrative research and work around how the brain functions and how that impacts our spiritual formation and how we could be thinking about those things in ways that bring life and joy and peace the way God intended for us to be. So I naturally began following his work because I was so intrigued by the level of thoughtfulness and integration that he was bringing to this topic and the ways that people were benefiting from it. And then lo and behold, he ended up through mutual friends leading a small group experience in the basement of somebody's house in South Boulder, maybe 2 summers ago, and led us through what became an actual book, but he was still in the process of refining the content. And it was designed to be quite group-based interactive in order to have your soul, your mind, your brain begin to wrap around these topics. And so my husband and I and many other couples that are friends of ours were part of this basement experience over the course of several months. And central to the theme was this idea of learning to love our enemies. And guys, this has been a topic. Eddie's been sick of me talking about how important this is.
No, not at all. Preach on. Preach on.
Margaret's been hearing me talk about it, and my family, my friends.
Have Jim here.
Yes, I know. We're so honored. We're so thrilled. So I'm hoping that we can take what I absorbed over some time in that basement in Boulder and bring this to our group here at Backstage, because In recent days, this has been a practice that I have been far more intentional about loving enemies than I have been in any prior season of my life. And I'm so grateful for the handles that I was given to try to make progress in this clearly important imperative or command that I at best probably barely even thought about, if I'm honest, Jim. I have to say, I'm not proud of that, but especially as our team at Backstage was thinking about all the different ways our culture and our churches right now feel like there's a lot of division and us and them and enemies. We hoped that this would be a timely and timeless message for all of us, and I can't wait to relearn those things. So I'm going to start being quiet while we begin letting Dr. Wilder speak.
Let's just jump right into this conversation. Our topic for today is how to actually love your enemies. And without restating anything you just shared, let me just say I talk to pastors day in, day out here in South Florida and really across the nation. And this is a topic that in the last 2-3 weeks has really risen to the surface of churches that were somewhat unified before this election are now finding themselves just completely divided. Friends are becoming enemies. We're seeing marriages for the first time split. One of the themes over here, and in fact, we just had a guest on there saying marriages are splitting and experiencing greater tension because of the political cultural moment that we find ourselves in. So Dr. Wilder, could you please just share some wisdom with us on, is it actually possible to love our enemies? How do we do that?
Well, I see that you wore a red shirt and I have a blue shirt, so we've got a problem started right there.
That's good. This is salmon, okay? Salmon.
Oh, very good. Yes. All right. No, but you're very right. You know, one of the things, the highest value in America is niceness, and so we have really built our Christianity around trying to be nice, which makes it very hard to admit that we have enemies. But actually, our brain has what I call enemy mode, is that it goes into. And when we understand that dynamic, you realize that as soon as I feel that you're not on my side, we're not together, my brain switches into this different way of looking at you that says, we're not going to connect here, so I have to defend myself. I have to protect myself somehow from you. Once that happens, you know, most of the psychological interventions since the 1960s have been around communication. So we're just supposed to communicate, but unfortunately, when you're in enemy mode, communication doesn't work, because whatever you say is treated as though it were incoming bullets. And so this enemy mode is something we need to recognize, because our brains go into rather readily. You know, how many times do I feel like I'm in this by myself? You know, it's very easy for me to get into that. Let's see, in the last week, when my granddaughters said something, put me in enemy mode. I've got, my wife is the best of anybody, you know. She'll say something and, you know, I will think she's not on my side. And I don't want to call her an enemy. If you ask me about it, I said, oh, well, she's not my enemy. Then I said, well, why have I stopped listening to you? Why have I stopped connecting with the first sign is my curiosity of what you're really thinking disappears.
Yeah.
So I'm no longer thinking about what you're about or how you got to be here or why you're saying that. I'm at best waiting for when you be quiet. Here's what I'm going to say or respond back. That's enemy mode. And so the simplest form of enemy mode is we just stop tracking the other person. And in fact, James, when he talks about the characteristics of becoming a Christian, the first signs of faith, he says, is that we are slow to anger and quick to listen. I would say that he's basically describing staying out of enemy mode. So the first sign that we are actually being saved is that where we previously stopped listening and felt like enemies, we are now actually very interested still in each other. But you know, when we're all being nice, it's kind of harder to tell when that sort of things happens. So
would this be a case where people are, in a sense, they're othering So kind of the first step of enemy is I'm going to, in a sense, dehumanize you and other you.
Yeah. And your brain does that for you automatically. As soon as it switches into enemy mode, and the relational circuit checklist that just popped up on the board is a good way to self-examine. Typically, you will do one of these things classically. I just want to make the problem or person or feeling go away. That's the early sign of enemy mode. I don't want to listen to what other people feel or say. My mind is locked into something upsetting. I don't want to be connected to someone I usually like. That's the one that's sort of a classic, my wife comes down, I work here in the basement, and she comes down and she immediately feels like an interruption, like, why are you here to bother me? Now, normally I would like her, but I was focused on a project. And so in that very moment, my relational circuits have gone off. Other times I just want to get away or fight or freeze. Some people can more aggressively interrogate or judge or fix others. So, the 1,000 questions begins. So if your answer to any of those is yes, then your relationship circuits are off and your brain has already dropped into this kind of simple form of enemy mode.
Can we just pause right here and just give some time to this? Because I'd love to hear the three of you talk about when I go through this checklist, not only do I go, done that, every pastor and ministry leader I know lives in this reality a lot more than they want to admit. Has that been what you all have found?
Well, Jim, I have a question for you, maybe a comment is, we used to have a cute little dog, a Shiba Inu, and this dog would, if you reached out and tried to pet her, she would go on defensive. And it looked like she was being aggressive, but she was actually just being defensive. And as I listen to you, what I'm hearing is that people seem to go aggressive in enemy mode, but perhaps it is, they're trying to be, their brain is having them be defensive actually, but it comes out as aggressive.
Yeah, it really can go. It can really go either way. The second form of enemy mode is when you get into overwhelm, and then it does clearly, you bare your teeth and we call that stupid enemy mode, because that's when we do and say things that are stupid, and we say to ourselves afterwards, "Why did I say that?" Or it's much easier to detect in other people too, because we can see them getting stupid right away. And that's the thing that the political situation right now has gotten people doing. And social media makes it so much easier to do and say something stupid before you think about it. Say it and click, and then you come back and go, "Oh, that wasn't very relational." But here's the interesting thing, which I think we should circle around to before we get too far down the line. And that is that as soon as we're in enemy mode in our brain, our sense of connection with God and God being on our side disappears. And so before we go too far on this, I think it might be very helpful to say we want to make sure that as we're going through this, talking about all the things that can put us in an enemy mode, that we have our connection with God going very, very strongly. And so that's actually the solution. We have to get back to connecting with God. And from a brain perspective, it's pretty straightforward. Theologically, we can't really explain how it works, but basically it starts if you can bring your brain to something you're grateful about, thankful for, especially if it was a good moment with God. Then from that moment, we can say, "Oh, I'm glad God is in here." And you know what that does to your brain? Immediately it says, "I'm not alone." So when I'm not alone, my brain comes out of enemy mode. When I feel like I'm in this by myself, there's no one on my side, my brain is looking at the world and everybody around me as though they were enemies. And I also want to say that the problem in enemy mode is you can't tell if other people are or aren't. We encounter most of these as counselors or pastors. People come in, something bad happens in their life, they feel alone, And all of a sudden they feel like God is their enemy. He's not on their side. He's not caring about them. He's not connecting with them. Marriage conflicts, the same thing. Board meetings, elder meetings, angry church members, all these kind of things. You're actually trying to help them, and they're biting you like the little puppy, like, wow. Like, no, I'm actually on your side, but their brain can't tell it. And of course, when we're in enemy mode, our brain can't tell either. And so often we're not nearly as alone as we were. So going back and connecting with God, saying, what do I appreciate about God? And if I can connect with a memory, a time when I was actually close to God, I felt his presence, his care. Remembering that memory awakens, just like bad things are kept in memory, things that bother us, so are our good relational moments. So going back to those things, I remember one time saying to God, okay, I need to know a time when you were with me. And it came to my mind about being up in a mango tree when I was a kid. I was about 120 feet off the ground. It was a warm day and it was a nice place to lay back. And the picture that came to my mind was I'd fallen asleep up in the tree and I was rolling over and looking down at the ground 120 feet below. Well, what kept me from falling that day was the thought had crossed my mind to take my belt off and wrap it around the tree and myself. So I was actually being held back by my belt. This is the days before seat belts. But all I remember, this was a terrifying memory. And so I asked God, why are you, am I remembering this as a time when you were with me? And the thought came to my mind, I'm the one that told you to put your belt around the tree. And suddenly this feeling of gratefulness, like God looks after me in those times when I think I'm alone. I thought I was pretty alone up there in the tree. And if I go back to that memory, looking at the ground now, I feel the belt around me. I feel God's care. By connecting to him in that memory, spending a moment or two there, I'm now starting to look at the world a little bit more from God's perspective. And it's those kind of moments we want to remember. And I suggest to people that you make a list of these appreciation memories, these connection with, I call them 5-bar memories, like on your cell phone, you got 5 bars when you really got a good connection. Make a list of them, because when you're in enemy mode, you won't be able to think of any of them.
So Jim, I wanted to just check in with him hearing. So I saw we had before fight and flight. And that's kind of the automaticity, right, of the brain. So if I'm hearing you right, this kind of enemy mode is kind of that automaticity. And what we want to do is slow that down and bring that the frontal lobe into play with memories and gratitude. So it's not running down our spine, as it were, and getting all spider tingly and angry, and we don't know why, but to try to slow that down, right? And then bring it up here in the frontal lobe where we can communicate with God.
Yes, I would say that's 3/4 of the picture right there, slowing it down, getting the prefrontal lobe on, connecting with God. Might be a little bit technical, but there's one kind of enemy mode, which we call intelligent enemy mode. And in that one, you actually have your frontal lobes on. You're tracking the other person's weakness and you're out to get them. This is what political forces do with each other. And that's what we're seeing all over the place. And if you ever had a feeling that somebody that you know is, like in a custody battle, they're tracking you, but they're not on your side, we can actually be very intelligent about enemy mode. And most of the times I've ever been called into a church situation usually it's sort of a crisis or a post-mortem, like something really bad went down here. There's been this kind of intelligent enemy mode where people have been tracking each other and trying to win, usually quoting scripture all the way. And generally the one who justifies himself the best is in intelligent enemy mode. They've thought everything over. They know quite scriptures.
That's so well said.
Isn't that
Yeah.
fascinating, the stupid enemy mode and the intelligent enemy mode? And as I'm listening to you, I can feel the difference when people are in those different modes.
You know, one of the things that we've often said here at the Backstage is fatigue leaders make poor decisions. And one of the things that I'm hearing is, like, when we're in enemy mode, we are prone to make some very poor decisions. We're prone to write off people. We're prone to anger. And you in a lot of your speaking and writing have actually talked about there are some very practical ways to kind of orient our brains back to who we are and who we belong to and who God is. Can you just speak to some of that? I think you call it the Emmanuel prayer.
Yes, that would be the way that you look at how's my brain running. I asked people around the world, is God always present? And most people will say yes. I remember asking a group of pastors one time if God was present when people were sinning, and they had to think it over a while to see if it was, the case. But they ended up concluding that even when there's sin going on, God is still present. But does your mind notice that? Right. So Emmanuel is God is with us. So if he's with us, a complete memory of your experience should at any time and place include what God was doing there. So what we found, part of the early part of the life model was dealing with people with trauma. People in trauma always feel alone, like the world is their enemy, and they're not aware of God's presence. But this interesting thing happened as soon as they became aware that God was there, healing started. So the whole question is, how do you help people become aware that God is there? Well, the interesting thing too about fights and conflicts in the present, as soon as you are aware that God is there and active and present, your mind starts processing things differently. So Emmanuel prayer is basically, let's start my prayer by becoming aware that God is here, instead of just ending my prayer there. So again, going back to our memories, just like trauma, our relationship with God is memory mapped. So let's go back to the times that we were really connected with him. Takes your brain about 2 minutes to get plasticity going. It's got to get the chemicals circulating. So you've got to stay in that memory with God for 2 minutes, and then you can ask him the question, what do you want me to see about this particular situation or this moment? And so when we're in enemy mode, this is part of the process that we use with people, to help them realize God's with you right there. Now, getting his perspective, it leads you out of enemy mode in the same way that it leads people out of trauma and other kinds of experiences. So this active participation with God we can structure in a pretty simple technique that works most of the time for most people. However, I'll also add that when I'm really upset, I can't get myself out of enemy mode. And I have to sit with somebody who's got a better connection with God right now, and sort of like borrow their spiritual Wi-Fi. Like, if you connect with God
so good.
right
I like
now, up here where I live in the mountains, most people can't use their cell phone, so they get no signals. They say, "Can we get on your Wi-Fi?" Yeah, they get on my Wi-Fi, then they got a signal, right? I think that's what we do when we're upset too. It's we need to borrow somebody else's connection with God. I'm still in relational mode, so I can help sort of pull you until you can get your signal back with God again. So start out by looking at things that you are times that you really remember connecting with God. If you can't do that, at least be thankful. And Mindy, I think you have something there, a little cup that helps you feel thankful in the morning. Your coffee?
Yes, I am very thankful right now.
Right there. See,
Good.
Something as simple as that, just feeling, okay, I'm thankful, I'm present, I'm connected here. God, I may not be thankful for anything else you did in the world, but you did make coffee, and we're that something as simple as that can get us started, and we stay there for 2 minutes, enjoying our coffee, inviting God into that experience, and then we can say to him, okay, help me look at these other situations. I'll give you kind of one other illustration that comes to my mind. I used to live in northern Minnesota, and it would get 30, 40 below. My car wouldn't start. I was a college student, had a cheap car, right? So my friend would come over and we'd try to figure out how to start the car. But did we stand out in 40 below to do it? No. We sat in the kitchen and sipped coffee, talked about our plan. Then we would rush out there to 40 below, try to start the car. And if it didn't work, we ran back to the kitchen and thought over our plan, what we're going to do next, right? This is what I suggest we do here. If we connect with God, let's sit in the kitchen with him and enjoy some coffee and say, what do you want me to do in this difficult situation? How do you want me to see and act with this enemy type person? Then if I go to think about them and engage with them and it quickly drops to 40 below, we run back into the kitchen and sit with God and talk it over again instead of staying out there and freezing our spiritual selves. So that's to me just a simple illustration of how Emmanuel prayer sits. It's sitting in the kitchen with God, sipping coffee, talking with him about what he wants us to see. And as soon as things aren't working, we run back to the kitchen.
Yeah, I think I recently heard you describe it as texting with God, which is just a fun way to think about that.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah. Then instead of journaling, which can go on, it's like, let's send a quick message and get one back before we go on. So we'll experiment with that yet this hour, I hope.
Oh, that's good. So we talk a lot about resilience on this show. I mean, it's brought to you by resilientchurchleadership.com. And pastors are experiencing the need for resiliency. They're getting a crash course in resiliency right now. How would you relate enemy mode and the awareness of what our brain is doing during enemy mode to help us in resilience?
Well, nobody likes enemy mode. It is wearing people down. I think if you watch some of the main political leaders becoming more and more unhappy on TV, you see what enemy mode is doing to them. Mm-hmm. It's aging them a decade in a year, that kind of thing. So the problem with our mind is we can't really keep it from going into enemy mode. Resilience comes from how fast we get out of it. So if I spend 90 seconds in enemy mode and get out of it, it's going to be a lot different than if I spend 3 days in enemy mode. That's just going to wear my emotional capacity down something awful. And, not to mention how much damage I may have done to important relationships during those 3 days. And very often there's people who've spent years and sometimes their entire adult life in enemy mode with certain people, and you can see from their face that it's low joy. We can't actually scan your brain and see how much joy you've acquired across your lifespan. It's there's a center in the brain that'll light up, costs about $3,000 to do the brain scan, but most of the time we can scan your face and tell pretty much the same thing. So we want to make sure you learn how to get out of it quickly. Don't try to keep from going into it. Learn to recognize enemy mode when you're in it, and the faster you get out, the more resilient you become.
No, that's really helpful. Very helpful.
Can you say something just a little bit about how you can catch yourself? Because I find myself, I'll be having a conversation in my head that's probably gone on for a half an hour, and I don't realize it until I get to this point, like, whoa, just let's stop this. Yeah. So is there anything you can suggest of how to nip it quicker so that we're not going on for hours or days?
Yeah, well, yes. The first thing I would suggest in terms of nipping it quicker is be prepared to be curious about it. People who want to attack themselves because they're in enemy mode or think poorly of themselves, your brain already doesn't want to notice it because it knows you'll get on your case as soon as it sees it. So what you actually want to say is, I hope that I'm going into enemy mode about 200 times a day, and I'm going to be curious about when I get there. And so the more curious we are about ourselves, I want to learn everything I can about enemy mode. And the second thing is then I'm going to look for God. So the signs that I'm in enemy, my relational circuits are off. We got the little checklist. We actually suggest people carry that around for the first month or so, and then keep checking yourself and going, oh yeah, I've been in that for 3 hours. The next time it'll be 2 hours, and the next time it'll be 1 hour. So the more times you check, the faster you'll figure it out, unless you get on your own case about it, in which case your brain will want to hide it from you. Like, he'll peck me to death if I notice. So
do you find that some people in ministry have a harder time admitting to being in that enemy mode, or that some people are willing to be more curious than others?
Well, the thing about it, yes, is that ministry puts a certain pressure on everybody that really wants to make us sort of narcissistic. It's sort of, if you're in ministry, it's automatically your job to make God and the church look good. And so to have any problem, you're failing on your main job, which is you're supposed to make us look good here. And the community around will make that real clear. We internalize that very fast. And so and also in traveling the world, I've yet to find a single culture that values weakness. And so if you show weakness as a leader, it just attracts vultures, something fierce, right? And so a tender response to weakness, which is actually what's needed, is something that we rarely experience, and most pastors haven't been taught how to teach it to others. So, and every culture will, if you were to say, I'm a weak pastor, I've got weaknesses, the reception you anticipate isn't going to be a good one, right? So if we look at this as a weakness, we would say, I want to hide it. I don't want to notice it. I'll get attacked.
Let's stop right here and park some time on it, because if we're honest, so many pastors and ministry leaders live in a church culture and in a denominational setting where weakness is not tolerated, showing vulnerability is not tolerated. And I was just talking to someone this morning, actually, that in evangelical world today, we are so consumed with leadership development, and we are becoming less and less concerned about followership. And Jesus is so much more concerned about our followership, because that's going to determine our capacity for leadership. And in followership of Jesus is the admission that I am weak, that I do not have it together, that I need God and I need his help. And Mindy, you've spent so much time trying to orient and remind leaders of this principle. Margaret, you have as well. Can we just talk about the effects on the church when we don't sit in this reality?
Well, yeah, I think a lot of the subtext of the work that Jim was introducing to us and what became the book looks like this, was this issue of narcissism in the church, which has as its underlying, well, there's many things that can be said about that, but the deep refusal to acknowledge one's own weakness, and for entire systems to deny weakness. The results of that are everywhere, and so unfortunate, because it's not what Jesus invites us into. It's not what he demands or expects of us, but somehow these human systems that we are creating and perpetuating are buoyed by false senses of strength, and somehow that we're there's nothing that we can't do. And there's even Bible verses that we use to reinforce those things and stay away from the very uncomfortable feeling of weakness. And yet it's in that weakness is how we come to Jesus in the first place. And so we we don't know how to stay in that grace, in that dependency that we begin with as we move into roles or levels of responsibility where people are looking to us to solve things, do things, etc. And it's a very nuanced form of leadership that I haven't encountered all that often, and I hope to bring that myself, and I'm sure many times I fail, but that my leadership is coming out of what I'm receiving from God, if anything, and how we experience ourselves as dependent is vital to why I would continue returning to God, as Jim's suggesting. You know, why do I keep running out of the cold and into the kitchen? Well, isn't that weakness? Well, no, because the one who's sitting in the kitchen knows what I need to do to that car and 1,000 other things. But to me, that metaphor is a beautiful one to describe the wisdom in returning and acknowledging one's weakness until one hears the direction that will be helpful. And then even to imagine, as we do that as communities, sometimes we think the leader goes on high and spends time with God in the kitchen, and then they come out and pronounce everything. And it's like, well, how does actually a group of people hang out in the kitchen with God and hear what God is saying? So yeah, I think this is a vital thing. I just wanted to go back to one quick thing as Jim was talking, then I want to hear what Margaret has to say on that too. But this is the carpet in the room where I was taking this class with Jim and his wife and others who are part of leading this movement. And he said, you know, recommend holding that in your as a card, physical thing that I kept with me, but I knew I would lose the card, so I put it on my cell phone. And I've literally in meetings pulled this out to revisit that list. And the first time I read it or heard him convey it, I thought I am one of those people who has spent, I think, years in some of those places of being quite shut down and possibly feeling safe or protected by that level of being shut down. But it was such an invitation to embracing weakness, to a better way. And that's why I'm so glad we're all here talking about this. But anyway, those are some of my reflections on this. And finally, I'm glad that I've often said coffee is one of my core spiritual practices. And now I have even more language and a professional person to defend that.
I want to go back to Jim as quickly as possible. I just want to reflect, Jim, on what you just said about being curious. Mm-hmm. And also kind of on how important that is. And also when we're talking about going in enemy mode, it seems like it's a full body experience. You were talking about, you know, this aging people. It's not just in our head, but it's our whole body that's impacted when we're in enemy mode. So I wonder, when we're being curious, am I sleeping? What's keeping me from sleeping? So what kind of bodily things are those in ministry experiencing right now? And are people being curious about it in order to keep out of enemy mode? That's kind of what I'm hearing.
So one of the things that I'm also hearing too, just to piggyback on this is, and I think you really just said it, Mindy, is it feels safer for a pastor or a leader in ministry sometimes to stay in enemy mode. It feels safer to not be curious about why am I experiencing these things, because we feel like we're in the right, that we've been wronged, etc. But I would love just to hear you, Jim, speak on why does it feel safer to stay there?
Yes, the reason it feels safer is because it shuts down our sharing other people's pain. It just keeps us isolated with our own pain, which at the moment looks like an upgrade. But the fact of the matter is, our relationships quickly dissolve if we lose the ability to feel other people's pain. The problem with life is that Jesus said it's going to hurt to be alive right now. But he goes on to say that if all you want to do is avoid pain, do the math, because the way the universe works is going to switch in the future, and it will hurt to be dead, and it will not hurt to be alive. So for the shorter run in all of our lives, that's how I interpret Jesus' teaching about the future. If all we want to do is avoid pain, we actually end up killing ourselves.
And that's what a great line.
The long. So we're going to suffer actually, and it's part of entering into that suffering for a redemptive purpose. You know, why are we entering into the suffering? It's actually because that's how God feels about it. And when I look at somebody as my enemy, I'm actually the farthest away from God's perspective that I can have. So my main reason for wanting to get out of enemy mode is I actually want to be with God. It's this with God life that actually got me into ministry to begin with, and I wanted everybody else to enter into that. And this is the moment when it counts. Right now, you know, in as far as it was done to the least of these, it was done to me. Well, maybe we're the least of these right at this moment. And it's being done to us, we want to bring the presence of Jesus into it. I've often said to my friends, well, if this is going to be a bad day, shouldn't we make it count? And the only way to do that is to enter in from God's perspective. So I'm looking for enemy mode in my own life. And I've actually given my best friends and my wife and children and others permission to tell me when they think I'm in it. And my response to them is learning to be thank you. I didn't want to stay in there that long. And so when they're reminding me, when I can share this with other people, I've invited other people to pull me out of it, you see. And the people around me are much better at spotting it quickly, actually, than I am. They can usually tell in seconds if good old dad has gone into enemy mode. And rather than having them trying to not say something, because it'll only make it worse, inviting them into my weakness and saying, yeah, this would be, Dad, are you seeing God's perspective right now? I taught this to my granddaughter, my daughter and granddaughter, when the granddaughter was almost 3 years old. Okay, and my daughter had gone into stupid enemy mode and was sort of yelling in the kitchen. And so the granddaughter said, Mommy, please, let's get Jesus, you know, and we taught her a little sign, you know, when you're overwhelmed, you just go, ooh, we need Jesus here. And so she went, Mommy, and Mommy started laughing at the 3-year-old doing this thing. And it was, you know, this is, you know, we really need the people who say, you know, Pastor, isn't this the moment that we need Jesus? I remember how I learned it myself that way. Someone was yelling at me, and in the middle of yelling at me, she said to me, and very, very loud, she called me several things that I don't think Teamsters know how to say. She said, aren't you a Christian? And I said, well, yes. He said, then shouldn't we pray? Because Christians pray when we're in trouble, and we're in a blank bunch of trouble right now. Never had it occurred to me that was a good moment for Jesus, you see. I'd rather you didn't learn it that way. But
yeah, that's good.
You know, the more we go back to this, the more we realize those are the moments we really want Jesus' perspective. We can help each other not stay there so long. We've got the checklist, got all these other good things. But being curious, you know, includes, how did I learn to react this way? Let me review my list. I bet I've got some times back there when I forgot Jesus was around, didn't notice it. No one helped me learn it. And maybe if I can get good at this, I can teach it to the people around me. So here's an interesting thing that happened in our board meeting, because I work for a nonprofit. We taught people to notice when we're losing our peace and our relational circuits are going off. And we actually had somebody who, using the scripture from Colossians 3:15, let the peace of Christ be the referee, had a little whistle. And when we lost the peace of Christ, we lost our relational circuits, we lost curiosity, our board referee would say, okay, let's stop and get connected with Jesus again. Let's all, and then we'll restart this discussion when we're all back, got our connection. At first it was awkward, but it didn't take more than about 2 board meetings of doing things this way to realize we got a whole lot more done when we stopped this way, and people began to thank the referee. Soon we didn't actually need one because others were saying, hey, I just lost my piece here. Can we stop a minute? Let's all get reconnected. And, usually everyone else went, yeah, we did lose our piece. Thank you for stopping us. This is teachable. This is practicable. We can actually do it in our families. I think a 3-year-old can do it. Probably, us older folks can too.
Hey, this is so rich. And Jim, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing this time with us. And we're getting a lot of engagement on Facebook. So if you're listening on Facebook Live, just want to say hey and give a shout out to you. We're getting some really good questions from our audience. And if it's okay with you three, I'd love to actually give some time to address some of these questions. And friends, if you have a question, continue to put that here in the chat on Zoom or on the comment section on Facebook. But Jim, we've actually gotten 2 people here chiming in asking for your personal view or interpretation of 1 John 4:20, obviously where it talks about if you love God and hate your brother or your sister, you can't love God. And one of the questions here is, does brothers and sisters of that verse, would you see that applying to just Christians or to everybody?
Well, the answer to that would be the brothers and sisters are the easy ones. They're the ones that we have some attachment with already. It's kind of interesting when Jesus would stay out and pray all night, he would send the disciples off in a boat. He didn't keep them out praying with them, doing the spiritual discipline stuff. He put them in a boat in a storm where they had to get along with each other and learn to work together. And so he's headed to Jerusalem for crucifixion. They're walking down the road talking about who's the greatest. Working out these things with each other. Basically, John is saying, if you can't do it with a human being, don't anticipate that you'll be able to pull it off with someone you can't see. And this is actually how the brain works. We've discovered over the 30 years of watching people that people have these great moments with God where they feel loved, but if they don't practice it with people, nothing changes in their brain. They develop no actual muscles from repetitions. And so I think he started out by saying, let's do the low bar first. If you can't do this with your brothers and sisters, don't think it's working with God. And then Jesus moves that bar up and says, even the pagans love their neighbors and the people around them. Our bar is, can we love the people who hate us, who don't like us? Can we see in them future brothers and sisters if they were to enter the kingdom? And so I think John starts us out low, and Jesus moves us up high. But I think it's quite practical. If our brain can't do it with people, don't really think it's very solidly developed with God. This idea that, I really love God, but people I can't stand. That indicates lack of practice for our brain in these. Using what I think is the best tool for spiritual development. That is just noticing every time someone feels like an enemy, getting into God's perspective with that, and then answering the question, what do God's people do here? And if we bring other people along, now we're doing it together, because as I said before, if I get upset enough, I'll lose my connection to God, and I'm going to need some people with me, or this isn't going to last under storm conditions.
That's really good. Got another question here. He says, I lead a mid-sized church and been talking a lot about loving our enemies. However, most of my people automatically associate that with the political moment. How is much of what you're describing transcend the political moment?
Well, I'll give you a real quick example of this one right here. Had a PhD in psychology, thousands of hours of training, all of which was sort of communication based. And when my wife would come to me and she said, Jim, we need to talk, my stomach would turn to lead And I'd say, you know what, probably later in the month, like the 28th or something, I might have some time to talk about this. It was like I didn't want to do it because she was actually, she'd come to me and she'd be upset about something and always had to do with me. And so my mind was already in enemy mode, right? Like, I'm about to get attacked here and I don't like that, and I'll put it off as long as I can. And then when we did start, she'd say to me, Jim, stop being a counselor. I don't need a counselor. I need a husband here. And I go, you're pulling my last tools. You know, what am I supposed to do now?
I tell that to my wife all the time. My wife's a therapist, and I'm like, listen, don't pull that on me right now. Totally understand that.
Yeah. Well, this would pretty much blow a day if it was good, and it might take 2 or 3 days to recover from this, Jim, we need to talk. So what we ended up doing is taking this Emmanuel process. Then once we learned that somewhat later, and what would happen is my wife would have a problem. She would connect with Jesus in a moment. She would text back and forth with God about it. How do you want me to see this? How do I have your experience of this in there? And then when she had Jesus' perspective on it, she would come to me and say, Jim, I've just gotten peace about something that was bothering me. Would you like to hear me? I'll read my texting with Jesus to you. My reaction was entirely different inside. I grab my cup of coffee and I go yeah, I got some time right now. Share your peace with me. Bring God's perspective. And I think to myself, maybe I'll get God's perspective on something that's been irritating me as, sort of a side effect here. So this idea that, we turn to each other to get our peace when we're upset is very, very hard on one another. But if we turn to Jesus and say, let's have him in this moment, you see, that's enemy mode. That goes way beyond the political moment or whatever else. It means that every time I'm losing my peace, I want to see where Jesus is and what does he want me to see. Now we're participating with Jesus in the moment, as long as we hold on to that. And we realize we're here for a very valuable purpose, as opposed to just getting beat up and shot by our enemies. It's really hard to put into words exactly the shift that makes within us.
So
But,
Go ahead, Mindy.
I was just thinking, so for a pastor of a medium-sized church where people are assuming the enemy is somebody who thinks something different politically, for them, would it be valuable to just begin with the sort of daily, ordinary ways that I move into enemy mode and learning to talk to God and bring that into community? As a way of then communicating that out to a congregation? Like what would the starting point be for that?
Yes, well, I hate to promote a book, but
good.
Right here,
please
the
do.
other half of church here that Michael Hendricks and I wrote together is basically on how to do this sort of thing in church, says there's 4 things we have to do. We have to basically teach people what joy is, so you can practice a little joy. You need to teach people how to form a stronger attachment to one another, which is typically not part of our Christian work. Then we need to teach people a little bit about how to take correction. And those are the 3 of the 4 elements right there. But when we enter into this and say we're learning to do something we're not good at, we're facing our weakness together, there actually is a way to learn these things together and encourage one another. So there's a format there.
That's good.
Before we run out of time today, I would like to walk us through a simple 4-step process, which might be useful for, it's basically taken out of this.
Well, I would say, please take the liberty to do that right now. And friends, like the checklist, Jim's book is all going to be on our website at resilientchurchleadership.com. But in our last 5-6 minutes here, would you just walk us through what this practically looks like, this idea of Emmanuel prayer?
Yes, I think Sitara has a slide for us to look at right there. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to, if you got a little paper or something to write on, we're going to write down a simple text of something we're thankful for, a gift, a blessing from God, and just direct it to God. God, I'm thankful for this. And I'll give you 30 seconds of silence to do that. So next, listen for a thought or an idea that comes through your mind that would be God's response to that thankfulness. You just said, thank you, God, for this. And now he's sending you a text back in the form of a thought. Just write down what he might have said back to you. Now we ask God, bring to my mind a time in the last week when someone felt like an enemy to me. And just give it a one-word title. Quickly go back into the kitchen where it's warm. Remember that appreciation, thankfulness that God is with you, and ask him, what do you want me to know about loving that person? Now what we're going to do here is just give any unfinished conversations to God. And we're going to say, God, would you hold this conversation? If I'm not peaceful, I didn't have enough time here to talk about it. I'd like to finish this conversation with you. Really, I'm curious about your perspective. So just hand it to God, and we'll pause right there. And you've just seen the process. So we, some of these conversations will take a little longer. But when you're finished with them, just like my wife would read them to me, it really helps to read them to someone else. Now, I'll just say the average pastor has harder time doing this than most people, because we get a lot of anxiety about God. Did this God really say this or that? But here's what I would suggest, without having a chance to really talk about the brain. When you're listening for God, the thought will almost always appear within the first 5 seconds. And it takes about another 5 seconds for us to notice it. And so usually by the end of 10 seconds, we've got a thought in our head. We're just not sure whether it was our thought or God's thought. And the thing about the brain is, if we're trying to think with God, the answer will always be both. So we're not actually looking to take dictation from God as though He were going to write some new scripture through us. We're actually trying to notice God's thoughts that have God content in them. It may be, slight God content or pretty thick, but we're trying to think with Him. So when we read it out loud, we're actually running a check to see, let's see as I read this out loud, if it actually has some God content that impacts me. And it's really quite remarkable how very quickly most people will perceive this in their mind, but rather than doubt it, just write it, read it out loud. And we notice the signs of God content in 2 ways. One is it brings us a sense of peace, like shalom, like that really makes sense. That's true. And it also does it for the people around us that are willing to check it with us. So, we should. The problem with little narcissistic thoughts is that we can always make ourselves feel peaceful by telling ourselves what we want to hear. But if we're doing this with some other people that are connected with God, that won't work. So there's reasons to run multiple tests. And ultimately, we test it against scripture and things like that. But this is a process we can do together, and we can do it imperfectly, but it starts leading us back to peace. and a start of how do we see our enemies the way that God does.
Jim, just want to say, man, thank you for that very practical tool and way just to kind of orient us back to getting out of enemy mode and getting us back aligned with just who God is, what he's done, and who we are. And man, I really appreciated that, as I know a lot of our listeners did. Mindy and Margaret, thank you so much for making time for this conversation week in and week out. And thanks to you for tuning in. If you've been with us here on Zoom or here on Facebook, we actually do this each and every week. We just take a moment to focus on the backstage of our lives and kind of speak through the noise that exists in so much of today's culture with so many weary and tired pastors. We believe that healthy leaders lead healthy churches, and healthy churches are the ones that are going to change the fabric of their region. So if you appreciated today's webinar, can I ask you just to like or share it on Facebook or whatever social media platform you have found us on, and tune in next Thursday at 2:00 Eastern Standard Time as we continue the conversation here on the Backstage Project of ResilientChurchLeadership.com. Jim, thank you so much once again. Friends, thank you. We'll see you next week.